The recycled air hummed a monotonous tune, a subtle counterpoint to the cacophony of rolling suitcases and chattering passengers. Danielle Harris, her face obscured by the brim of a worn baseball cap, navigated the cramped aisle of the Indianapolis to Charlotte flight with unpracticed ease. She found her window seat, 24B, and settled in, the familiar weight of her service weapon a cold presence against her hip. The phone in her hand buzzed with incoming emails, a steady stream of coded updates she scanned with a practiced eye. Her outward demeanor was one of casual indifference, a carefully constructed mask that hid the sharp focus of her mind. Tonight's flight wasn't a vacation. It was a transit point, a brief pause in the relentless rhythm of her undercover assignment. She needed to blend in, to become invisible amidst the mundane drama of commercial air travel. Margaret Reynolds, clutching her oversized handbag like a shield, entered the plane with a palpable air of apprehension. The aisle seemed narrower, the passengers louder, the air thicker than usual. Her gaze flitted nervously around the cabin, settling on Danielle. A flicker of something unidentifiable, something akin to discomfort, crossed her features. Danielle, seemingly absorbed in her phone, registered the look peripherally. She knew that look. She'd seen it countless times, a subtle tightening of the lips, a slight aversion of the gaze, a barely perceptible stiffening of the shoulders. It was a look that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Margaret continued down the aisle, her pace slowing as she neared row 24. She paused, her hand hovering over the back of the seat in front of 24B. A deep sigh escaped her lips, a sound that betrayed a complex mix of resignation and annoyance. Danielle, still ostensibly engrossed in her emails, felt a tightening in her chest. This was it. This was the moment the charade began. She could almost feel the invisible lines being drawn, the silent battle commencing in the cramped confines of the aircraft. Margaret finally settled into the aisle seat, 24C, her movements exaggerated, as if maximizing the distance between herself and Danielle. She placed her handbag on the empty middle seat, a physical barrier that mirrored the invisible wall she had erected in her mind. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the impending departure. Danielle felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the heightened anticipation of takeoff, the collective holding of breath. Margaret, however, seemed oblivious to the general hum of the cabin. Her focus remained solely on Danielle, her gaze darting furtively towards her, then quickly away. The plane began to taxi, the gentle rumble vibrating through the seats. Danielle closed her eyes, feigning sleep. But beneath the surface of her apparent calm, her mind raced. What was the source of Margaret's discomfort? Was it her clothing? Her demeanor? The subtle curve of her lips that hinted at her ethnicity? Danielle had learned to dissect these micro-reactions, to decipher the unspoken language of prejudice. It was a skill honed over years of undercover work, a necessary shield against the casual cruelties of the world. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her body pressed against the armrest, as far from Danielle as physically possible. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. I don't feel safe sitting next to her. The words weren't uttered aloud, but they resonated with a deafening clarity. Danielle could practically feel the weight of Margaret's gaze, the unspoken accusation. It was a familiar weight, a burden she carried with a stoic resignation. The plane ascended, the pressure changing in the cabin. The recirculated air hummed a monotonous tune, a subtle vibration against Margaret's skin. She adjusted her floral scarf, the silk cool against her neck, but the chill she felt wasn't from the plane's air conditioning. It emanated from the woman beside her, a quiet presence that had settled like a stone in her stomach. The final boarding call echoed through the cabin, a clipped, automated voice marking the point of no return. Margaret's fingers tightened on the armrest, the plastic slick beneath her sweaty palms. Trapped, she thought, the word a silent scream in the confines of her mind. The woman Danielle, according to the boarding pass Margaret had inadvertently glimpsed, remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the safety demonstration flickering on the screen overhead. Her stillness, however, felt more like a coiled spring, an unsettling energy that Margaret couldn't decipher. Why couldn't she have sat somewhere else? Anywhere else? The flight attendant's voice, soothing yet authoritative, filled the cabin, reciting the familiar litany of safety procedures. Margaret barely registered the words, her attention snagged by the rhythmic tap of Danielle's finger against the armrest, a steady, almost hypnotic beat. It wasn't loud, but in the pressurized quiet of the cabin, it felt like a drum against Margaret's eardrums. Tap, tap, tap. She shifted in her seat, the stiff fabric of her trousers rustling against the faux leather. Danielle's eyes flickered towards her, a brief, neutral glance that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. She averted her gaze, focusing on the safety card tucked into the seat pocket in front of her, the illustrations blurring into a meaningless jumble of lines and arrows. Just breathe, Margaret. It's a short flight, but the air felt thick, heavy in her lungs. The flight attendant's voice continued, a background hum to the escalating tension that crackled between Margaret and the silent woman beside her. Danielle felt the weight of the other woman's gaze, a palpable pressure against her skin. She didn't need to look to know that Margaret Reynolds, a name gleaned from the half-hidden luggage tag, dangling from the woman's oversized handbag, was watching her. Years of undercover work had honed her senses, making her acutely aware of the subtle shifts in body language, the unspoken anxieties that rippled through a room. Margaret's discomfort was a tangible thing, a static charge in the air between them. Danielle suppressed a sigh. This wasn't her first rodeo. She knew the script by heart. The averted glances, the nervous fidgeting, the barely concealed distaste. She'd seen it all before. Let play out, she told herself, her inner voice calm and detached. Let her reveal herself. The safety demonstration ended, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, preparing for takeoff. Margaret felt a surge of panic. The confined space, the close proximity to Danielle, the knowledge that she was trapped for the next 2 hours, it was all too much. She pressed the call button, the small plastic disc cold beneath her finger. The chime echoed in the quiet cabin, a sharp, insistent sound that mirrored the frantic beat of her heart. Just get her moved. Another seat. Anything. Yes, ma'am. The flight attendant arrived, her smile professional and practiced. I don't feel comfortable, Margaret stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured vaguely towards Danielle, unable to meet her gaze. Danielle remained still, observing Margaret's performance with a detached curiosity. The fear in the woman's eyes, the subtle tremor in her voice, it was all so predictable. Almost pathetic, she thought, a flicker of something cold and hard sparking in her chest. Is there a problem? The flight attendant asked, her voice laced with a hint of concern. I just don't feel comfortable, Margaret repeated, her voice rising slightly, a tremor of desperation creeping in. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The flight attendant's smile faltered, replaced by a look of polite confusion. I'm not sure I understand, ma'am. Is something wrong with your seat? Margaret opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to somehow articulate the vague, unsettling feeling that had taken root in her gut, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain the irrational fear, the prejudice that she knew, deep down, was fueling her discomfort? How could she admit to the flight attendant, to herself, that the source of her unease was the woman sitting quietly beside her, a woman who had done nothing wrong? Mom. The flight attendant's voice, now tinged with impatience, prompted Margaret to action. I just don't feel comfortable, she repeated, the words a broken record, her voice trembling. She risked a glance at Danielle, who met her gaze with an unervingly calm expression. In that moment, something shifted. Danielle's hand moved, smooth and swift, reaching into the inner pocket of her jacket. Margaret's breath hitched in her throat. A silver badge flashed, catching the dim cabin light. FBI, Danielle said, her voice low and steady, the word a stark contrast to Margaret's frantic whispers. Is there a problem, ma'am? The air in the cabin seemed to solidify, the hum of the plane fading into the background as every I turned towards them. Margaret's face flushed crimson, the color spreading like a stain across her cheeks and neck. The words died on her lips, replaced by a strangled gasp. The flight attendant, her eyes wide with surprise, quickly recovered her composure. "Agent Harris," she said, her voice regaining its professional smoothness. "Is there anything I can assist you with?" Danielle's gaze remained fixed on Margaret, the silent weight of it a tangible force. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice still low, but now laced with a hint of steel. "I believe the situation is resolved." The flight attendant nodded, her eyes flickering between Danielle and the now speechless Margaret. "Of course, Agent Harris. Please let me know if you need anything further." She turned and moved down the aisle, her presence a silent reprimand, a public acknowledgement of Margaret's humiliation. Margaret sank back in her seat, the shame burning in her chest, hotter than any anger she had ever felt. She closed her eyes, the image of the flashing badge seared onto the back of her eyelids. The plane began to taxi, the rumble of the engines a dull roar against the silence that had fallen between her and the woman beside her. Trapped, she thought again, the word now a different kind of scream, one directed inwards, echoing in the hollow space of her own prejudice. The recycled air hummed a monotonous tune, punctuated by the occasional cough or rustle of a newspaper. Margaret Reynolds felt a prickle of sweat beneath her collar. The woman beside her, Danielle Harris, remained unsettlingly still, her gaze fixed on the miniature screen embedded in the seatback in front of her. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, the cheap polyester of her blouse clinging to her damp skin. "Why did she have to sit next to me?" she thought, the question a bitter refrain in her mind. It wasn't just the woman's unsettling stillness, or the way her eyes, dark and watchful, seemed to absorb everything without revealing a single flicker of emotion. It was something else, something intangible that set Margaret's teeth on edge, an unease that blossomed into a full-blown aversion. Danielle felt the weight of Margaret's gaze, the intensity of it a palpable pressure against her skin. She kept her eyes fixed on the in-flight movie, a mindless action flick that provided a convenient distraction. She'd seen it all before, this subtle dance of discomfort, the barely concealed glances, the almost imperceptible shrinking away. It was a familiar script, played out countless times in different cities, different airports, different planes. Beneath her practiced composure, a flicker of weariness ignited. Just a few more hours, she thought, then Charlotte, then home. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendant, a young woman with a strained smile, began her pre-landing checks. Margaret seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a tight whisper. "I need to speak with you." The flight attendant, juggling a tray of discarded headphones, paused. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked, her voice professionally neutral. Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously at Danielle, who remained absorbed in the movie. "It's about my seatmate," she stammered, her words laced with a carefully cultivated helplessness. "Who don't feel safe." The flight attendant's smile faltered. "Is she bothering you in some way?" she asked, her gaze flitting between Margaret and the seemingly oblivious Danielle. "Not exactly," Margaret replied, twisting her hands in her lap. "It's more of a feeling, a bad feeling." The vagueness of her complaint hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Danielle felt the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the subtle prickle of attention. She could sense the curious glances, the whispered speculations. She knew what they were thinking, what Margaret wanted them to think. A wave of exhaustion, tinged with a familiar bitterness, washed over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself for the inevitable confrontation. The flight attendant, caught in the awkward crossfire, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, can you be more specific?" she asked, her voice laced with a growing impatience. "Has she said or done anything to make you feel unsafe?" "It's not what she's done," Margaret insisted, her voice rising slightly. It's just a feeling. I think she should be checked or moved. I really don't feel comfortable sitting next to her." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The murmurs around them intensified. Danielle finally turned, her gaze meeting Margaret's. The older woman flinched, her eyes widening slightly. In that moment, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable flashed across her face, fear, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, something akin to shame. But the flicker was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of righteous indignation. "You were saying?" Danielle's voice was quiet, almost a murmur, yet it cut through the cabin noise like a shard of glass. Margaret puffed herself up, her voice regaining its brittle edge. "I was just telling the flight attendant that I don't feel safe sitting next to you. I think you should be moved." A muscle twitched in Danielle's jaw. She reached into her jacket pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, and withdrew a small leather wallet. She flipped it open, the glint of a silver badge catching the light. "FBI," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Special Agent Harris. And you were saying?" The silence that descended was absolute. Margaret's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The flight attendant, her eyes wide with shock, stammered an apology. The whispers around them died, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Danielle tucked the badge back into her pocket, the weight of it a familiar presence against her ribs. She turned back to the movie screen, the flickering images a meaningless blur. She felt the weight of the stares, the silent judgment, the unspoken questions. But beneath it all, a flicker of something else ignited a quiet satisfaction, a cold, hard triumph. She had won this small, insignificant battle, but the war, she knew, was far from over. The weariness returned, settling deep in her bones, a constant reminder of the invisible burden she carried. The flight droned on, the hum of the engines a lullaby of exhaustion and resignation. Outside, the sky began to lighten, the first hint of dawn painting the horizon a pale, uncertain gray. The cabin air, once thick with unspoken tension, now crackled with a different kind of energy. Margaret Reynolds felt her cheeks burn, the heat spreading down her neck, a stark contrast to the frigid air conditioning blasting from the vents above. Just moments ago, she felt a righteous indignation, a simmering frustration at the perceived encroachment on her personal space, on her comfort. Now, that indignation had curdled into something bitter, something humiliating. She tasted bile at the back of her throat. The small, leather-bound badge, still held loosely in the other woman's hand, seemed to pulse with a silent, accusatory power. "FBI." The letters swam in her vision, blurring with the unshed tears pricking her eyes. How could she have been so wrong? So stupid. Danielle Harris, her expression still carefully neutral, tucked the badge back in her jacket pocket. The movement was economical, precise, like the click of a lock sealing shut a vault of secrets. She watched the crimson flush creep up Margaret's neck, the subtle tremble in her hands. Danielle hadn't enjoyed this, the forced revelation, the public dismantling of another's prejudice. It was a necessary evil, a calculated move in a larger game, a game where the stakes were far higher than a cramped airplane seat. She allowed herself a small, inward sigh. Another pawn moved, another ripple in the pond. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the low hum of the aircraft and the quiet rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. A few rows ahead, a child giggled, oblivious to the charged atmosphere. The smell of stale coffee and recycled air filled the cabin, a familiar scent of confined spaces and unspoken anxieties. Margaret's ears roared with the unspoken judgment of the surrounding passengers. She could feel their gazes, sharp and pointed, like needles pricking her skin. She'd been dissected, analyzed, and found wanting. A wave of nausea washed over her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the thin, worn fabric of her seat. A throat cleared nearby. It was the flight attendant, her previously placating smile now replaced with a thin, professional line. Her eyes, though, held a flicker of something else, something that looked suspiciously like amusement. Margaret flinched inwardly. The amusement wasn't directed at her, not exactly. It was the amusement of someone observing a predictable, almost comical, downfall. Someone who had seen this play out before. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began, her voice firm but carefully modulated. "If you're uncomfortable, we can find another seat for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Not would we find another seat, but can we? A subtle but significant shift. The offer wasn't an act of service, but a veiled dismissal. Margaret stammered, her voice barely a whisper above the engine's drone. "Two didn't mean." The words trailed off, lost in the echoing chamber of her shame. What could she possibly say? That she'd judged a book by its cover? That her fear, her prejudice, had blinded her to the reality of the woman sitting beside her? The words felt like ashes in her mouth. Danielle observed the woman's distress. A flicker of something akin to pity, or perhaps it was simply weariness momentarily softening her gaze. She'd seen this reaction countless times, the stammering justifications, the desperate attempts to reclaim a lost dignity. It was a predictable pattern, a human algorithm of shame and regret. Yet, each time, a small part of her, a part she kept carefully guarded, felt a pang of empathy. Empathy not for the prejudice itself, but for the fragility of the human ego, the desperate need to protect the self-constructed image of righteousness. The flight attendant, sensing the finality of the situation, moved to address the other passengers. Her voice, now regaining its professional warmth, flowed smoothly over the hushed cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief interruption. We'll be resuming our beverage service shortly." The rustle of movement returned, a collective exhalation of held breaths. Conversations, previously muted, began to rise again, though now tinged with a subtle undercurrent of shared experience, of a silent commentary on the small drama that had just unfolded. Margaret sat frozen, her gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. The world around her seemed to buzz with a muffled intensity. She felt exposed, stripped bare of her carefully constructed facade of politeness. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. She hadn't meant, but intentions, she realized with a chilling clarity, were often irrelevant. It was the actions, the words, the unspoken assumptions that truly mattered. And hers had spoken volumes. Danielle, sensing the woman's complete withdrawal, turned her attention back to the window. The world outside was a tapestry of darkening clouds, the city lights below twinkling like scattered diamonds. She closed her eyes, letting the low hum of the aircraft lull her into a semblance of calm. The incident was over for now, but the larger game, the intricate dance of deception and revelation, continued. And she, the silent observer, the unseen hand, would continue to play her part. The muted roar of the engines intensified, a low thrum vibrating through the cabin floor and into Danielle's feet. She felt the familiar press of acceleration, the slight tilt backward as the plane began its ascent. Indianapolis, a patchwork of lights and concrete, shrunk beneath them, swallowed by the growing darkness. On the small screen of her phone, lines of code scrolled past, a meaningless dance of characters that served as a convenient shield. Her outward composure was absolute, a carefully constructed facade. Inwardly, a small, wry smile played on her lips. The woman beside her, Margaret Reynolds, had gone rigid, her breath held tight in her chest, her gaze fixed on the window as if willing the plane to stay grounded. Danielle had sensed the woman's unease from the moment she'd settled into the aisle seat. The subtle shift away, the quick, assessing glances, the tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. It was a familiar dance, one Danielle had learned to recognize in her line of work. Prejudice rarely announced itself with a shout. It preferred to whisper, to hide in the shadows of averted gazes and forced pleasantries. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign pinged off, and a collective exhale swept through the cabin. Danielle continued scrolling, feigning absorption in her phone. She felt Margaret's gaze on her, a palpable weight in a confined space. The woman's perfume, a cloying floral scent, hung heavy in the air, another layer of discomfort in the meticulously orchestrated tableau. "I'll let it fester/I," Danielle thought, her inner voice calm and detached. "I'll let the discomfort bloom into something tangible/I." It was a calculated risk, this game of subtle pressures and unspoken accusations. But Danielle knew her role, understood the power of silence, of allowing prejudice to expose itself. Margaret cleared her throat, a small, nervous sound that echoed in the relative quiet. "Excuse me," she began, her voice tight. Danielle looked up, feigning mild surprise. "Yes." Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin, seeking allies in her unease. "I was wondering if you might be more comfortable in a different seat, perhaps further back." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Danielle's expression remained neutral. Inside, a cold satisfaction settled in her stomach. The bait had been taken. "Is there a problem with this seat?" she asked, her voice even, devoid of any emotion. Margaret's face flushed a delicate pink. No, not at all," she stammered, her eyes flitting to the flight attendant making her way down the aisle. "It's just I'm a bit claustrophobic." The lie was transparent, flimsy as a spider's web. Danielle saw the flight attendant pause, her professional smile faltering as she took in the scene. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice trained to soothe and defuse. "Yes," Margaret said, a touch of desperation creeping into her voice. This young lady is making me uncomfortable." The words, finally spoken aloud, hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Danielle felt their gazes, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She met the flight attendant's eyes, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. This was the moment. She reached into her jacket, the small, leather-bound ID flashing briefly in the dim cabin light. "FBI," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The effect was instantaneous. Margaret's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as if a valve had been opened. Her mouth opened and closed, a silent gasp caught in her throat. The flight attendant's eyes widened, her expression shifting from polite inquiry to stunned understanding. The whispers started then, a low murmur rippling through the cabin. Danielle watched, impassive, as Margaret shrank back in her seat, the weight of her assumptions crushing her like a physical force. The flight attendant, recovering quickly, offered a curt apology and moved on, her steps brisk and purposeful. The rest of the flight passed in a thick silence, punctuated only by the hum of the engines and the occasional cough. Danielle returned to her phone, the scrolling code now a genuine distraction. She felt the weight of Margaret's gaze, no longer accusatory, but filled with a different kind of weight shame. The whispers continued, a subtle undercurrent of disapproval. Margaret remained frozen in her seat, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the small screen in front of her, the in-flight entertainment a welcome escape from the reality of her humiliation. The landing was a blur. Danielle gathered her things, her movements precise and economical. She paused briefly by Margaret's seat, the woman still hunched and motionless. "Have a good evening, Ms. Reynolds," she said, her voice devoid of any trace of irony or triumph. It was a simple statement, but in the charged atmosphere of the cabin, it felt like a final judgment. Margaret didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the empty screen. As Danielle walked down the aisle, she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, their expressions a mixture of awe and something akin to fear. The whispers followed her, a testament to the quiet power of observation, the silent victory of truth revealed. The incident, a small ripple in the vast ocean of human interaction, would likely fade from memory for most. But for Margaret Reynolds, the weight of that Thursday evening flight, the suffocating silence, and the burning shame would linger, a constant reminder of the invisible lines that divide us and the consequences of unchecked assumptions. The recirculated air hummed a monotonous tune, a constant backdrop to the tableau of human drama that had just unfolded. Margaret Reynolds felt her cheeks burn, the flush spreading down her neck, a physical manifestation of the shame that clung to her like a second skin. The silence in her immediate vicinity was deafening, punctuated only by the rustling of a newspaper a few rows ahead and the muted clinking of ice in a plastic cup. How could I have been so wrong? So stupid? She thought, the question echoing in the hollow cavern of her humiliation. She could still feel the phantom weight of Danielle Harris's gaze, cool and assessing, like a surgeon evaluating a particularly egregious wound. The badge, small and silver, had flashed with an almost blinding intensity, reflecting the harsh overhead light directly into Margaret's eyes. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a mirror, reflecting back the ugliness of her own assumptions. Danielle, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the dramatic reveal. Her expression, previously guarded and neutral, remained unchanged, a smooth, unreadable surface. She returned to her book, the pages turning with a quiet rustle that grated on Margaret's already frayed nerves. She probably deals with this all the time, Margaret thought bitterly, her internal monologue a relentless cycle of self-recrimination. People like me, making assumptions, judging. She risked a glance around the cabin. The other passengers, previously oblivious, now seemed acutely aware of her. Their stolen glances, some curious, others disapproving, felt like tiny needles pricking at her exposed vulnerability. A man across the aisle, previously engrossed in a movie on his tablet, now stared out the window, his jaw tight. A young woman, seated a row ahead, craned her neck, her eyes flitting between Margaret and Danielle. The air crackled with unspoken judgment. Margaret wished the earth would swallow her whole. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a practiced smile, returned to the aisle. She paused beside Danielle, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was an unspoken apology in her gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice Danielle had endured. Margaret watched the interaction, the shame twisting into a bitter knot in her stomach. She should be apologizing to me, Margaret thought, the fleeting surge of defiance quickly swallowed by the overwhelming tide of guilt. No, she shouldn't. I deserve that. I deserve this. The flight continued, each minute stretching into an eternity. The hum of the engines became a relentless drone, a soundtrack to Margaret's inner turmoil. She tried to distract herself, to focus on anything but the burning shame that engulfed her, but her mind kept returning to the incident. The subtle shift in Danielle's posture when she first sat down, the careful way she arranged her belongings, the almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine when Margaret had addressed her, all of it now seemed laden with meaning, a silent plea for space, for respect. Margaret had ignored those subtle cues, blinded by her own preconceived notions. She had reduced a complex, intelligent woman to a stereotype, a collection of assumptions based on nothing more than the color of her skin and the texture of her hair. The final descent began, the plane tilting, the world outside the window shifting. The city lights below twinkled like scattered diamonds against the darkening canvas of the evening sky. For Margaret, however, there was no beauty in the view. The approaching landing felt like a descent into a deeper, more profound level of shame. The incident, though brief, had etched itself onto her consciousness, a permanent scar on her memory. She knew she would carry the weight of this encounter long after the plane touched down. This Thursday evening flight, seemingly ordinary, had become a crucible. It had exposed the insidious nature of prejudice, the way it could fester beneath the surface of polite society, waiting for an opportunity to erupt. The confined space of the airplane, the forced proximity of strangers, had amplified the impact of Margaret's actions, creating a microcosm of the larger societal struggle for equality and understanding. Danielle's quiet dignity in the face of prejudice had served as a stark reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, the strength it takes to navigate a world often hostile and unfair. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, the plane taxiing towards a gate. The seatbelt sign chimed, releasing the passengers from their temporary confinement. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, Margaret remained seated, her gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. The world outside the window, the bustling airport, the promise of a new beginning, seemed distant and unreal. She was trapped in the confines of her own shame, a prisoner of her own making. The lesson, harsh and unforgettable, had been learned. But what cost? And how many others, like Margaret, carried the weight of similar unspoken prejudices, oblivious to the damage they inflict until confronted with the stark reality of their actions? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, a silent challenge to every passenger stepping off that plane and back into the world.